Good morning. It's almost 10 a.m., so we will get started. My name is Dan Lips. I'm a senior fellow with the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Thank you so much for being here today. The title of our conference is Freedom in Progress, and I can think of no area of public policy in American life where we've seen as much freedom in progress over the past few years than education reform. As a little background, I joined the team at FREOPP in 2019 after spending most of the last decade working on Capitol Hill. Before that, I'd spent a lot of time working as an education researcher at think tanks from 2000 to 2010. But I'd been out of the field for a while. And when Ovik brought me into FREOPP, his first charge to me was to study and we called it mapping equal opportunity in American education. And so with some fresh eyes, I looked at the landscape of American education and found a few big picture takeaways about the state of equal opportunity in American education at the time. And the first really big one was that American schools had equalized funding for children from different socioeconomic backgrounds. When we think about some of the challenges in American education, often we're thinking about resource inequality. But as of 2019, schools that serve disadvantaged kids were spending more than schools that were serving rich kids. But where we saw big inequality was in access to a school of their parents' choice, access to a high-quality teacher, and access to outside of school learning opportunities. And this was in 2019. And just over the past 5 years, we've seen truly historic changes in American education, thanks to the leadership of some of the people on this panel. This year, more than 20 million children now have access to attend a school of their parents' choice. And Robert will fact check me on the exact number, and that's why I
40.
invited him. I was instructed not to provide bios, but we have a terrific panel for you here today. Robert Enlow is one of my personal heroes. He's been leading the national movement to expand parental choice in education for a quarter century or more now. And I personally admire his leadership and his vision for expanding choice through universal programs. He's been a visionary on that front. Representative Candice Pierucci was the leader of the Utah Fits All scholarship bill. She sponsored 2023 was called the Year of School Choice. And I think Utah was first to move on a program that will become universal and a model for the nation over time. So we're thrilled you're joining us today, and thank you for your leadership. Beyond education choice, at FREOPP, we're also really interested in identifying through research opportunities to increase the return on investment from education. Over the past few years, our former colleague Preston Cooper did a lot of really pioneering work looking at ROI of college degrees and helping using public data to show if you attend a certain college, what you can expect in terms of your lifetime earnings. And I'm thrilled to have Arushi here today. We've been partnering with Learn Capital to develop a new and I think groundbreaking way to analyze private sector investment and the return on education and human capital development. And she'll dig into that in a few minutes. But to kick us off, Robert, you've been working on this for a long time. I think I met you in 2003. Back then, there were a handful of cities had choice programs, a handful of states had them. Where are we now? What are the big gains that have been made, but what are some of the challenges that we face?
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate the idea of getting 28 minutes into 3 minutes, 28 years into 3 minutes, which is easy to do, actually. For those of you who don't know, EdChoice is formerly the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice. We were started by Milton Friedman, the economist, and his wife. Our job is very simple. All children should get all choices with all the dollars set aside for kids. That's what we've been fighting for 28 years. When we started this movement in 1996, there were 6 programs operating in 6 cities and states, serving less than 10,000 kids. Today, there are over 75 programs in 33 states, Puerto Rico and DC, serving over 1 million children, and 40 million children are now, 40% of all children are now eligible. So it's been an amazing progress, particularly in the last 5 years. Couple things about that. One, The progress towards choice was inexorable. What you don't realize is, sitting next to you is the father of ESAs. He wrote the first ESA idea, and it was Dan's thing. So you should absolutely give Dan the credit. And when we were working in Arizona, and it was a great idea. So look, from what became a small movement of groups like ours fighting for universal choice, as they were going alongside, there were lots and lots of efforts to get low-income choice and lots of effort to get some small programs expanded. And there were groups like ours fighting and saying everyone should choose. And what happened as we were making this progress, and we were making progress from only small numbers of low-income children being able to choose to then increasing the income limits to 300% of free or reduced price lunch to 400%, we saw growth. And then the pandemic happened, and it kick-started this movement. I actually say the pandemic supercharged a movement that was already happening. And what ended up happening is it put parents front and center of this movement. And as a result of that, we've seen 13 states in the last 5 years enact programs that are basically everyone is eligible, where every single student is eligible to receive a choice. Now, as you think about that, that's fantastic progress, right, for the idea of school choice. However, that's not necessarily truly universal choice. So if we want to think about what we're looking for in America is for universal choice, we want all kids. That's great. Every child should be able to choose just like a traditional public school. But every child should be able to choose every option. Right? So we have a great state of Iowa that passed a choice program for all kids, but it's an ESA just for private schools, right? And so that's great, but it's not perfect. Or, and I love my state of Utah a lot, right? It is a program that allows all kids to choose all the options, but it only gives $100 million. So that caps the amount of choice that you actually can give to everyone. So the programs that are the best are the ones that offer all three. They give all kids all choices with all the dollars. Those currently are Florida, West Virginia, Arkansas, and Arizona. Because the key thing is families do not want to have this sort of hesitancy on, do I qualify this year? Do I get the money this year? Am I sure I'm going to get it? Will the government give me the appropriation? The ones that are the best are the ones that have dollars attached to the funding formula. Indiana's a great program. It allows almost all kids to choose with all the dollars. It just says private schools. And so as you think about what creates universal choice and this vibrancy that's around stuff that you're doing and others, how do you create that? You have to create a marketplace. And so we've seen massive choice, massive growth. It's been really positive, right? Now the key thing is you can't build a movement without thinking about supply and information. And so we are brand new in the private school choice movement and understanding supply and information. Charter school has been doing supply for a long time. But private school choice has been not doing supply conversations and information for a long time. So as we look at what truly universal choice is and how we get to that, we've built the demand. Now the question is, how do we build the supply and build it going forward to create a marketplace, which has led to a lot of challenges.
Can you name those states again? West Virginia, Florida,
Arizona, and Arkansas. Soon to be Indiana. We hope.
But Utah's on the way. Thanks.
Yeah, Utah's 2 out of 3. I mean, if you think about it,
2 out of 3 ain't bad.
2 out of 3 ain't bad. I heard a song about that.
No, and to that point, I think too, as the chair of education in Utah, and I'll tell you, I'll put you in ground you in the political realities of running a school choice bill. Having full funding. We have a lot of kids in Utah. In fact, we are still having children. I know the rest of the country stopped, but we're still having kids in Utah. And so we have 10,000 students who are receiving the scholarship currently and using the ESA program. And we have 17,000 kids who are on a wait list. And we expect that wait list to balloon after our first year and parents starting to share the success they had. But I firmly believe, as a mother, that the best way to support education is to support our children's individualized, customizable learning experiences. And I got a lot of pushback when I ran my first bill, and it failed epically. But I'm so glad it did, because our policy that we came up with was universal, and it was a much better policy. And to any elected official in the room considering running school choice legislation, I will say you are going to catch hell for whatever you do. And whether you do a very, very tiny program that is just for low-income students or just for foster kids, or you name the demographic, you're going to get the same pushback you would for going fully universal. So go big or go home. And that's what we did. And so it's really exciting. Utah does have this opportunity to be It is universal in nature. There are no income caps. It is subject to funding. So we have $84 million put into the program now. We'd very much like to see that grow moving forward. But what's been exciting is to hear the stories of parents who are able to finally feel like they're back in the driver's seat and they have the tools in their tool belt to help their kids learn based on their learning styles and their learning needs. I'll also say this, we are unique in Utah. We are a very homeschool friendly state. We were just discussing this before, but we anticipate about 80% of our scholarship recipients right now are actually homeschool families. And that does introduce some complexities to it. And we have guardrails around the program and want it to be an innovative program. And we'll continue to fine tune it. But what's been exciting to hear it's predominantly moms who reach out to me who are just so excited about what they're able to do for their kids' education. I'll tell you, when I first ran this, someone said, "You're the chair of education. I can't believe you're running this bill." But what they said was, "You're the chair of public education. I can't believe you're running this bill." I said, "No, our committee is called education. And we need to get over this whole system mindset where we only want to talk about the adults in the room and not the kids and start prioritizing our students." And I do believe COVID accelerated support for school choice. And as parents were looking and seeing maybe at the gaps in their kids' education, they were even more adamant that they wanted to have more options. You can customize everything on your phone in an app. You can do your banking online. Like, think of all the things that we do from our phone, and the private sector has evolved, where education is like still this industrial model that was created a long time ago that we are still pushing kids onto this. And I'm a product of public education. I believe in strengthening the system we have, but I think when we talk about that, we need to take a comprehensive approach that moves beyond the system and says, what do kids need? How are they learning best? And how are they going to be most successful in life?
Just to expand the discussion a little bit, to tee up Arushi, when we're thinking about the big changes that are happening in American education, we're talking about giving families direct control of roughly $800 billion that's spent on the K-12 sector. Robert mentioned about 40% of the American kids now have access to private school choice. A lot of that's going into ESA programs that allow families to control their child's share of public school funding. It's likely that will pass 50% over the next year, depending on what happens in Texas and Tennessee and some other states. What could happen in the future is a true market of education where families aren't just choosing between schools, but are choosing for education service providers, tutoring, and accessing a lot of private sector services, which is why we're so excited at FREOPP to be partnering with Learn Capital on a new approach to thinking about how private sector investment increases human capital.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly exciting to hear about all of the progress happening in education. And as we talk about this, like as Dan mentioned, the most important thing that we should consider is the impact and the outcomes on our children. So we know that ESAs have very high parent satisfaction. We know that there is a lot of strong support from the parents. But when we look at the data, we have to be really, really clear about what is the impact. So in our framework that we've developed with Dan, we have two main dimensions that we look for in the impact of a policy or a company in education. And one dimension is cost and efficiency savings. And the other is what are the outcomes that are leading to increased lifetime earnings of these kids? Because for us as a company, and I think broadly in the US, social mobility is our North Star. We want our kids to be able to succeed. And ESA started targeting the most disadvantaged students in our country, in the foster care system, in low-income families. And when we look at the data, there have been a number of studies, as you know, on the impact of ESAs. We want to be really clear in which context ESAs work best, what style, whether it's the universal, meets all three, in which states. There are states that have constituents that are nervous in rural communities where they feel that ESAs might not help them. So it's just really important to understand the impact of what this could have in the different contexts that ESAs are being considered. And we talk about cost and efficiency savings, about per pupil spending. There's about 15,000 spent per pupil per year in the U.S. That's like $16 trillion. And when you think of ESAs, it has been shown in some contexts to be more cost effective and to drive efficiency at a lower price. So we should really consider that from a government taxpayer standpoint. But the other dimension, what we find very personally interesting, is the outcomes on the students. And the way that we think of lifetime earnings increase, we think of what are the leading indicators that we can measure today that might lead to more success over time and eventually lead to lifetime earnings increase. So I'll give you an example. Third grade literacy skills, which, by the way, less than 2/3 of the kids in our country are reading at grade level in third grade, which is terrible. Third grade literacy skills are highly correlated with high school graduation rates. And high school graduation rates are highly correlated with college entrance, college graduation, lifetime employment, and therefore lifetime earnings. So we can take these early indicators and think about what are the ramifications for a child's entire life. And as it is today, the number one predictor of a child's SAT score, college, or lifetime earnings is not the school they went to or how smart they are or anything like that. It's truly what tax bracket their parents are in. And that is something that 100% needs to change. And I'm really confident in our approach to using high impact programs, high impact technologies in driving that impact. Because right now, as it stands, the most disadvantaged kids in our country are still suffering. So I'm excited to hear more about the progress that we've been making.
So I love hearing this, and I think one of the biggest challenges we face as a movement is to figure out what we mean by accountability. So as you're talking and I'm listening, I'm hearing high school graduation rates and I'm hearing college matriculation rates. All of those are based on Carnegie units, right, which have a huge problem, right, I mean, in many, many ways. And so as we start to think about these programs and what we're really trying to get out of them, right, like I don't know about you, but as a parent, I always said to my children, I want very simple things for you. I want you to be a good person. I want you to get out of high school and college, and I want you to get out of my house in that order, and get a job. And so, like, getting a job.
I've told my kids they can live there as long as they want. My little boy can't get married. They got to stay with me.
I get it. You
like
know,
35.
I get it. I understand. As long as they're tax-paying, productive members of society, right? And so, so I think one of the most important things that you're doing is how do we really gauge the impact of families that have different ideas of what accountability means to them, right? Is civic tolerance important to you, right? I want kids who are tolerant of other people's opinions and thinking. If you believe in that, then you would send your kid to religious private schools every day. Right, the data is super clear on this, right? Because you create more tolerant children if you send your kids to private schools. So I think as we think as a society, we got to start thinking, what is it we're actually trying to get out of education, and how do we customize it to the point where you can show accountability without actually having a top-down system of testing, right? I like tests for many reasons, but not always.
If I can, Dan,
Yeah,
is that
please.
okay? On the accountability component, so in Utah, we do not mandate a test. And that was a major sticking point that I held the line on when I was negotiating the bill. Everyone kept saying, they have to have an assessment. They have to have an assessment. A lot of parents feel like their kids are over-tested, and it's why they choose to exit the system in some cases. And so what we landed on was a work portfolio requirement, which is something homeschool families are actually very familiar with across the country. They submit a portfolio to the program manager that demonstrates what they worked on throughout the year and their academic learning and progress. They have the option in Utah, if they don't want to do a portfolio, they are able to take a state assessment. But we are not going to start mandating assessments on kids. And I think to your point, the system is not built for innovation. And so when we talk about the challenges associated with it, it's the accountability measures that they're looking for. They may not find it. And so we have to tweak how we work on things to make sure it's working with both systems.
Definitely. And to underscore some of the different ways we're talking about accountability, and when we're thinking about accountability and testing within the K-12 system and within school choice programs, I think I 100% agree with what both of you said, that we need to be thinking beyond the traditional testing model. The framework that we've developed with Learn Capital is, I think, absolutely groundbreaking and completely different than what the public system does. We're talking about a venture capital firm that funds education ventures or largely ed tech companies developing new learning solutions and trying to use the best empirical research that we have drawn from decades of analysis of human capital development to try and measure, as a company provides services to lift up a child's reading scores over several months, what that may mean for their lifetime earnings. Think of how in the investment community, there's been a lot of focus on sort of social impact investment, but it's been driven from a very different perspective than that. What we are trying to spur is a new approach to thinking about human capital development from new education services. With that sort of context, I'm interested to have each of you think about sort of what's ahead. We're at the end of a year, a start of a new administration, a start of new legislative sessions. Nationally, Robert, what are we expecting to see? What are Representative Pierucci, what are we going to be seeing in Utah, and what are you hoping to do to get the many kids on your wait list access to your program? And what's the future of our this from the kind of private sector venture capital perspective?
So nationally, I think we're going to see a lot more, right? You're going to see more policies that are going to be passing. So I think Tennessee and Texas will be out there passing bills. So I look at Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming as well up in the Northeast. I think New Hampshire has a chance to go to universal. I think what kind of programs get passed, I think are going to be really indicative of what the future is going to hold, right? So I think Tennessee's and Texas's bills may end up being a little less robust than we would hope. But they're going to be a start to get to universality. So I think you're going to see more choices. I also think you're going to see the movement of school choice start to really think about how do we help families access this. Most families aren't even aware of choice. Like we publish this poll every year about the awareness. There are people who are in non-choice states are as aware of their choices as people in choice states. Right. And so this awareness conversation, if you're going to market to families, you need to actually market to families. And so you need to make sure they have a knowledge of what their choices are. And then I think the other conversation, people ask me all the time, well, what will be success to you, Robert? And I'm like, well, in 10 years, and we're still doing this, and schooling looks like it's the same, it's delivered in the same exact way, we've failed. Right? We have to change how schooling is delivered, particularly for our younger generation. If it's in front of a classroom, whether it's a private school, public school, or charter school, and it looks the same as it did 250 years ago, then maybe we haven't been successful in creating a marketplace. So I think there's going to be a lot of conversation about what does that mean for the future, and that's one of the things I'm most excited about Utah with.
Thank you. I'll say, of course, we're going to be doing a full press to try and get additional funding to it. We're at $84 million right now. We definitely want to see that number come up so we can meet the needs of our wait list. We also have I'm working on a massive cleanup bill. Again, we're going to be fine-tuning that program. We had anticipated about 50-50 of private school users and homeschool users having 85% of our scholarship recipients be homeschool scholarship recipients. Is also introduced to complexity, so we're looking and navigating that process. I will say two things. I am hopeful that what we're doing with our Utah Fits All scholarship will start impacting our public education system, because as competitive market forces start working, all ships rise with the tide. And I'll tell you two things. When I presented the bill, I was floored, absolutely blown away about the different minority communities who showed up in support of it. The Hispanic community came out in droves. They wanted to get their kids into Catholic school. They really felt strongly that they were being neglected and overlooked in the system. Surprisingly, the Polynesian community came out in droves, and their biggest concern was school safety. And I remember a couple parents who were in tears, and they felt like their kids were not safe at school. And when you look at why people choose to exit the program, school safety is actually a big deal. So my hope is, as we look at these gaps in the program where in the system where we're failing children and we're fulfilling those needs with a scholarship, my hope is that district schools say, man, we don't want to lose our funding. We should probably adapt. We should probably start reaching out to these kids. We should probably engage with parents more so that they're happier. Like, to me, in 5 years, if our district schools are more innovative, they've rolled back testing, and they're communicating with parents regularly, that's a massive win. And having a robust ESA program. And I think that's what we're moving towards in Utah. I will say we, again, are going to try and increase that funding model there because we have a lot of students who are interested in it.
I would just argue for an escalator. So you don't necessarily. So if you can't put it to funding formula, the
growth
concept
formula.
of an escalator formula, because that way because one of the things in the programs that we know that are most successful for helping public schools get better, it's when a child has a choice, automatically the funding goes with them. So places like Indiana and Ohio and Arkansas, the public schools know that they have to respond because it's not being kept to a certain amount of kids, and so that escalator thing is super more. So it keeps you also fiscally responsible.
It does. I will say in Utah, there are cost savings with students who are on the scholarship. It's an $8,000 scholarship. The average amount per pupil spending is actually $11,000 in Utah when you add up all the programs. So the idea is you're saving the state dollars while empowering parents.
Absolutely. I can't speak to policy as I'm not one of the policy experts here, but I can speak to impact. And to Robert's point, it's really difficult because yes, our kids are over-tested, they're overwhelmed, and it's apples to oranges, right? So private schools, they don't have to do state standardized tests. So how can you compare one type of assessment results to another? And that's why in the framework that Dan and Learn Capital and I have developed, it's really focused on not necessarily comparing this exact same metric to this other exact same metric, but just like looking at the impact of the changes. So looking at the system broadly, like let's say like 4 to 5% of students eligible are enrolling in school choice. When we look at the impact, of course, we have cost and efficiency savings like Candice mentioned, but when we look at the outcomes, what's important is, yes, how are the outcomes improving for the students who opt into the private school system or opt into the school choice movement, and in terms of their efficiency on the per spending basis, but also how is that affecting the public school students? And if the results are showing that the public schools are performing better, the outcomes are improving, then that is a massive win. However, the data is still in early stages, as the policy is still in early stages. So it'll be really important to see in which context this is the most impactful, whether it's in states like Utah that have a very strong homeschool movement, or states with more urbanized cities that have a wide array of options to private schools. That'll all be really important. And of course, again, when we look at the outcomes and the impact, we can still assess math capabilities, reading capabilities. We can still assess readiness, engagement, critical thinking, all of these really important education skills. Even if they aren't apples to apples, we can still look at those impacts and the performance levels, even when students are moving between the two different systems, to understand what is the impact. And again, not just for the students opting into the school choice movement, but also for the other students in the public school system and how the system at large changes. I think that is what excites me the most. And the power of education technology is quite profound here. So, state standardized tests, they have a lot of problems. We all know this. And technology can come in, private markets can come in and provide, leading indicators of readiness, of skills, innovative ways of assessments. Like Learn Capital is invested in a number of companies that assess students' like reading capabilities or functioning, and there are a number of different ways to do it. So that's something that we're definitely really excited about schools and governments accepting different forms of assessments and being able to measure outcomes in a way that is fair to the students and fair to the policy, and ensures that our dollars are invested in the most effective way to drive impact.
Really quick, Dan, if I can. I think, too, when we talk about social upward mobility, I'll put in a plug. Utah is #1 in the country for social upward mobility. And one of the things, our program currently, funding is, we're working on it, is income prioritized. When I ran the bill, they said, this is a giveaway to rich families. You've heard this a million times, right? You're just doing this for rich people. 99% of our scholarship recipients are in the low income bracket. And so to say that these families aren't craving options is an outright lie. And I think what's exciting is that to give them these tools and the resources maybe that they're not normally have available to them to be able to customize their kids' learning experience, I think that is another massive win in terms of social upward mobility and being able to get those kids on a track that's really successful for them.
Can I just quickly add, this is one of the I love this comment that you just made. In this movement, it's one of the few times we actually have to say educational justice. And so think about it for 2 seconds, right? We're okay as a society giving rich people $15,000 to live in gated, segregated communities. But we have a shock when we want to give them $5,000 or $8,000 to choose a school that works best for them. So if we're really thinking about transforming the system, right, we're actually trying to transform a system into a much more efficient. Milton Friedman said you create a fairer, more equitable, more efficient system by separating the government financing of education from the government running of schools. And so this is the key thing about school choice going forward. You have to give it to everyone, right, because low-income families are going to use it most, but we can't keep the existing system the way it is. It has to have some market choice competition, and it does when you create universal eligibility.
We got 15 minutes left, and please get your questions ready. But before that, I'll ask one last question. I'd ask for some quick answers. We're having this meeting in Washington at a unique time with a presidential transition. A new Congress will be starting at the beginning of January. Any outlook or recommendations on what the federal outlook should be in 2025?
I think you should ask John Schilling that question, who's been working with Invest in Ed. And so I do believe there's going to be a strong effort to get a tax credit scholarship program passed. It's already going through the system. There's been a lot of coalition building around it and a lot of work on it. And so I do think this administration is very interested in doing more choice like that. It seems like that's the right program, although I'm sure the administration will have its own comments on it. But I'm excited to see the growth in it.
When Utah passed our bill, the stars aligned. We were the first state to get a supermajority for a school choice program. We had 53 votes in the House, 20 in the Senate. And I say, like, when I've looked back, I don't know that we'd ever have that moment again within the 5 years I've been in the legislature. I feel like similarly at the federal level, the national level, we're seeing the stars align. And when President-elect Donald Trump put out his video about school choice, I was like, amen. Finally, we're talking about this at the national level. I also am hopeful to see some major reforms in the Department of Education in other issues when I'm working with the education community. When I ask about a reporting requirement or some restriction, like, oh, well, that's because we get federal dollars. So I think really reevaluating that 10% that we're taking at the state level from the federal government, I would love for us to revisit that.
Absolutely. I think broadly, more accountability and a stronger emphasis on outcomes, I think will be exciting. And then, of course, looking at the data for the states that have passed it and seeing what's changed will be really great for informing future policies.
Do we have questions?
My name is Kathleen Chandler. I'm with the Independence Institute in Denver, Colorado. My question is, since you think that the stars are aligned, is there an opportunity to completely dismantle the Department of Education? How could we do that? Because I believe that that would be the best. Because, you know, my thought is that the Department of Education has no idea what's happening in the one-room schoolhouse in Simla, Colorado. The Coloradans don't care. They don't care. It's too far away. So how do we dismantle this behemoth that you've just described?
I'll tell you, as a legislator, I've looked at buying ourselves out. Like, what is the replacement cost if we were to come to our schools and say, we're no longer having you take money from the federal government. We are going to cover the cost, right? It's largely free and reduced lunch, Title I schools. If you look back at education funding, it was actually around the time of desegregation that the Department of Education offered this grant money to try and encourage schools to desegregate. So anyways, that's happened. We've been successful in that largely. And so to your point, I think that it was a promise on the campaign trail. I know it's been said quite a bit. What that looks like, I think it would have to be like the great unwinding, because some states are much more reliant than others on it, and they would need to come around to replacing that funding or revisiting programs if they need to cut them. So I think that politically, you know, that promise has been made and that conversation is happening. As a state legislator looking at it and how intertwined the system is, I will be very surprised if they're able to do that in the first couple of years, because I think it would take a lot of unwinding and recodifying and, quite frankly, congressional action to make that happen.
Hi there, John Schilling, Invest in Education. I have one comment and one question. So Robert mentioned the federal scholarship tax credit bill. We've been working on this for several years. We do believe the president supports it. We have a lot of support in both chambers of Congress. I do think we're going to be able to get this done, probably as part of reconciliation to extend the tax cuts. I do want to say it is not a federal program. It is a federal tax credit. And the words Department of Education are not in this bill. The Department of Education will have absolutely no role whatsoever. My question was something that you mentioned earlier about supply. So one of the other things I work on here is the DC voucher program. And one of the problems that we have is that we have accreditation language in the statute that has really prevented high quality private schools from wanting to come to Washington, D.C. because of this very outdated accreditation requirement that we're trying to get changed. But what are your thoughts about how we go about increasing supply?
That's a great question, John. Thanks for asking that. One of the biggest challenges we face is how to redefine accreditation to allow new entrants into the market that are not necessarily looking the same. It might shock you to know that the most regulated private school system is in the state of North Dakota. It looks exactly like public schools. And so one of the things we need to do is we need to start passing bills at the state level which allow for different types of and models of accreditation to allow micro schools, for example, or learning pods, for example. You know, these are programs that are working very well in many states. We in Indiana, for example, just started a program 2 years ago, like less than 2 years ago, end of 2023, to try and build supply of micro schools. We've created 69 in less than a year and a half. And yet none of them can get a voucher. And so this conversation about rewriting what accountability looks like and who can receive bill support is a big deal, John. You can't get new supply unless you redefine who can be eligible to receive scholarships.
If I can just add really quick, I think too, having these programs in place, hopefully the market starts rising to meet the demand. I think right now, so in Utah, right, like our private school community, I think there's going to have to be a massive increase in options, and hopefully they start coming because we're now open to that. I would also say from a supply perspective, even from the program managers, a lot of states are shifting to a program manager model, right? Or I know others call it, is it a SGO?
It's program manager, whether it's
Program manager, right? There's lots of different ways states phrase it. Having those people with capabilities to really have that customer service, I think that's going to take time to scale up. So I was sharing this before. I feel like we are getting really innovative in the policy, and now we need to bring along the supply, because it's like in order for this to work successfully, we really need their help on that front.
Yeah, like in Tennessee, you only have Category 3 private schools going to be participate in the program. Those are the very regulated, well-known private schools. So you will have no new entrants into the marketplace. So that means you won't have any sort of new ideas coming up. You'll just have the same old stuff, which is fine. But school choice can do one of three things. It can fill seats in existing schools. It can build new seats in existing schools, or it can build new schools. And it hasn't done 2 and 3 very well, and it certainly hasn't done 3. And so as we think about choice going forward, we have to do number 3.
I would also say private schools largely have not talked to legislators. It's amazing to me. I promise, we talk to our districts regularly, like daily. It's like hourly. You might get a text, right? And the superintendents reach out. I was amazed, and I reached out to the private school community. I was like, are you guys, you coming? Like, you gonna come up here? And we had the largest group of children ever in Utah's history come up to the Capitol wearing I Love My Fit shirts for the Utah Fits All, and it made a difference. People, and then all of a sudden legislators were like, I didn't know I had a private school in my district. Oh my gosh, you're normal people. You're really nice. I like you. I think there's got to be also this awareness on messaging and outreach, because right now we're not hearing from them.
So that kind of raises my question, and being relatively new to this with our kids a lot older, when Dan describes this and it's about choice, well, everybody would be for choice. And I get the teachers union and the entrenched bureaucracy, but who would oppose this?
So the teachers union is the #1 organization that will oppose the bill. I was sitting in church on a Sunday after I'd been working on this bill, and all of a sudden, my fellow brothers and sisters started looking over at me like, what? And I was like, what's going on? And I have young kids, and I'm like, they're being quiet. Why are they looking at me? And individual came up to me, he's like, I just got a text with your face on a wanted poster. And I was like, what? And it was the teachers union had said, wanted, public education enemy #1. And I was like, wow, that was personal. And so, I had teachers texting me, or excuse me, emailing me from their official email. If you show up to our school, you will not leave alive. So I'm telling you, it is a very real wall you hit, but it's not just the teachers' unions. It's the superintendent's association. It's the actual system itself. And in rural communities, the largest employers are school districts. So their largest constituency is going to work for public education. And that is the challenge with rural school districts. So that's it. When I held town halls, I actually was bracing for impact, the first town hall I held, and I reached out to teachers and said, please come. I had 3 teachers show up. And when I walked them through the program, they're like, this is fantastic. And they said, there are 2 kids in my class I just can't reach. This would be perfect for them. Or one gal was like, this parent drives me crazy. And I was like, well, recommend the scholarship for them. Maybe this is a good fit. So it is really the system itself. And what is frustrating to me is when I was negotiating the bill, everyone wanted to talk about the adults in the room. And I said, does anyone want to talk about kids right now? And they're like, no, we're good. And that was telling for me.
So besides the teachers and administration, are there any arguments against?
There are, and so, but it's less, and I want to make sure. One thing that COVID did, I think, that really took away an argument, people who don't support choice tend to be white, educated women in suburbia, right? And a lot of it's because they bought their house, and that's the way they exercise their choice. And so, not in my backyard conversation. Now, COVID changed that because it changed the culture of education that people have been experiencing, and it really opened them up to a new culture. And that's why I think we're seeing such progress, is we're seeing an erosion of that opposition, because families in suburbia are like, oh my God, what were my kids seeing? I didn't know what was going on. Now they do. And so I think there was that issue of not in my backyard. Go ahead.
And yeah, just one quick thing to hit. There is a lot of fear amongst voters. Like I'm from Austin. Round Rock just struck down school choice. In this recent election, I think it was Kentucky, Nebraska, and Colorado who all the voters voted against school choice. And I think it's important to understand like how the voters might feel. And I'm sure you guys know this very well. I think there's a lot of it's been shown that parents have the highest approval ratings for their teachers and for their schools, and it goes down when you hit principal, superintendent, like state education, Department of Education. It just goes down like exponentially. So I think that a lot of parents feel strongly and people feel strongly about how great their public schools are and how great their teachers are. And there is a lot of sentiment that we should invest more in our public schools, we should invest more in our teachers. So I think that sentiment is a big driver of why people might be opposed to the choice movement. And of course, when we look at the data has, depending on who's running the study, you see a lot of different results. So I think that can also definitely skew perceptions.
I'll just add too, accountability, I'll hit on it. We are used to tests. We're used to getting that A on a piece of paper that says, wow, you learned something, you got an A. And so if you don't have that option in a school choice setting, how are you measuring learning outcomes? And that's people, I mean, if we're getting down to some move away from like the this is my turf and my money, people are worried about accountability measures. I feel like one bad story about someone misusing funds or like a fraudulent case can really be damning. I also feel like in Utah, we have a very strong service-oriented community. We're also #1 for service hours in our state. And every mom is a PTA mom. My mom did it. Every mom goes into the classroom, and when their teachers tell them they're coming for my position, they're coming for my money. And quite frankly, I don't blame the teachers. I blame the union for creating hysteria. When I read the union's email about the bill, I was like, oh my gosh, I would freak out. This is terrible, but it wasn't true at all. The other thing I haven't hit on with this bill is we reached a compromise. We gave teachers the biggest pay raise in Utah's history. When we passed this legislation, we married the two concepts. And so we could say we're prioritizing students and teachers, which the data shows if you have a phenomenal teacher, parent engagement, and engaged student, your kid's gonna succeed. So I do think Utah, we've been able to demonstrate we are not cutting funding for education. We have a $8.3 billion education budget in Utah. We continue to make significant investments. I think people get really nervous when they feel like you are taking money over from my students to help someone else. And that's where the scarcity mentality is a real problem, I think.
We have 2 minutes left. The gentleman in the second row.
Hi, my name is Jonathan. My question primarily focuses around competition and how that fosters innovation. So I know Milton Friedman and the whole entire laissez-faire market is all about how businesses can drive innovation by competing with one another, right? Private businesses. My question is concerning how private schools compete with public schools and how the bureaucracy of public schools may inhibit their ability to compete sufficiently with private schools. And furthermore, because public schools are upheld to a certain standard to separate things like religion and those sorts of beliefs from their curriculum, how can they compete with private schools when one of these really big choices that parents are making are around beliefs, around teaching their kids, putting them in a Catholic system, for example, like a public school, right?
1 minute left. Each of you take 30
Sorry.
seconds to,
I think we have to roll back a lot of the requirements we've put on district schools, and part of that is looking at those federal dollars that they're taking that have asinine requirements attached to them, if I'm being honest. When I ran the bill, I said to districts, bring me the list, and I will run the bill to roll it back. Because to your point, they've got to be able to respond. They've got to be able to innovate. But there are low-hanging fruit like parent engagement and customization that those tools are already available to them, and they just have to access it and have that push. The other point that is brought up is private schools get to pick who come. Public schools have to accept everyone. At some point, their scores will naturally be lower, right? And so how do you approach that? And how do we stop doing this apples to orange comparison and take a more holistic approach that is outcomes driven rather than that individual student and dinging that teacher for that? So I think we need reforms on both sides.
Robert and Arushi.
You can't create a competitive market unless you make public schools more market driven, which means you have to relieve them of a lot of the regulations, right? And what we see in America when it comes to school choice, we say, oh, we should make private schools act like public schools, and the answer should be the reverse, right? And so that's what we need to be doing is deregulation of public schools.
I don't have much to add. I think that you guys spoke really well.
Well, that's a great place to leave it. Thank you all for joining us for this panel. Please thank our